we continue to suffer long after the event that injured us has taken place. And it's not very easy to tell why we do that to ourselves. Why we keep torturing our own mind by reminiscing about things that hurt us and continue to suffer the consequences of that. The reason we do that ultimately is because we like to feel ourselves as real, as opposed to feeling an existential void. This channel is Meditation Amsterdam. My name is Pablo, and today the topic is how our suffering has a payoff of confirming our existence. And that's why we keep it in place. In order to understand how and why that is, we need to once again go back to a story that I often talk about in this channel, which is the idea that our psyches fragment themselves very early on in our lives. In our very early infancy, we go through a traumatic experience of feeling like we're very vulnerable. And when that takes place, the psyche becomes split. And it cuts itself away from body sensations, but it also starts to split itself into a big tree of what we can call object relations. So it starts to take snapshots of things and objects. It stores them into memory, and it forms relationships between all these things, and it creates a big mental map of what reality is about. At the core of that mental map is the biggest object of them all, which is the self, or the sense of being a separate individual. That is also an object, but it perceives itself, or it tricks our awareness into perceiving it as the subject. And once this has taken place, our entire lives are lived in a subject versus object duality. And I say versus very carefully, because whenever there is a duality, whenever there is a subject-object divide, there may be small truces of convenience that we form with situations and people, but in reality, though that truce is always conditional based on those situations and people bringing to us what we expect. And the moment that is not the case, then that relationship or that situation has its days numbered. The countdown begins the moment people don't bring to us what we want. So there's always a contentious relationship. And even the things, especially with the things that we love the most, we have a very contentious relationship with those because they can disappear. And if it's a person, they can remove themselves from our lives. And so there's in the background a kind of fear/resentment of this dependency that we form with objects. Now, there's another element in all this, which gets us to the topic of this video, and that is, what about not so much the objects that we desire and that contentious relationship that we have with them? What about the object itself, the individual sense of self, or the ego? Well, that one is also just an object relation. It is a series of mental processes that have coalesced or reified themselves into a supposed entity that you call me. And at the base of this entity is really the split in our psychosomatics that took place as part of our normal human development. But we go through our lives not just believing that this me is real, but in fact trying to arrange our entire reality, our entire environment, so that it serves this apparent me. And this me has a very peculiar quality to it, because even though the mind has reified it into an entity, it's not an entity. And deep in the recesses of your psyche, you can feel that. This is why we are afraid very often of being alone. This is why we are often afraid of being bored. This is why we are often afraid of being idle or feeling like we don't have a grip in our lives or a clear sense of direction. Anything that feels like a void, we truly despise, because it's too close to home. It's too much of a reminder that that which feels like to be me is really devoid of any real being. It's just a series of mental processes. Now, because this is very uncomfortable to feel, we will go out and chase all kinds of things, such as people, success, status, situations, living in certain places that feel better than others, and so on. Not to take away from the practical benefits of all of this, right? We're not here to advocate for a kind of what you could call a style of living which is depriving yourself of the good things in life. It's more to say that we try to fill the void of being that this sense of me has at its core through acquisition and accumulation. Now, if that fails, then the me has a completely different strategy, which is it clings to suffering instead. And suffering, as painful and inconvenient as it is, still has the payoff of confirming that the supposed me has real being. If you remember what we were just saying earlier, that supposed me defines itself in duality to the supposed other. So there's a subject-object distinction. And that supposed me can only ever exist if that duality exists. So that your egoic self needs friction and something against which it can compare itself and be in opposition to, in order to feel like its existence confirms real being. In order to do that, we often develop opinions about things, opinions about people. This I like, that I don't like. This person's an asshole. I adore so-and-so, but she has this little thing that I don't particularly like. All those qualities that we see in other people are implicitly being mentioned in opposition to or vis-a-vis a supposed me that is not like that, or that perhaps is like that but in a slightly different way, or not always. And that supposed me goes around pretending that it's calibrated itself to just the right level of how much of an achiever you are, the kind of things you eat, the kind of things that you appreciate in life. You might consider yourself to have just the right amount of elegance, but so-and-so has too much and therefore they're arrogant, or they have too little so they look too shabby, right? Whereas you hit the right spot every time around, or that supposed me. That's the implication of the supposed me. It preserves itself through comparison, and comparison inevitably brings friction. So that we preserve suffering, and once it's served its value to make sure that we protect ourselves, then we keep it going, because it's no longer protecting us from things that are dangerous, but it has become a protector of our very sense of being real, of being a somebody. And that is very, very difficult to let go of. If you have nothing to compare yourself against, then you're not really there. They've done studies with elementary particles, and when they remove everything that is around the particle, like a neutron or a positron, you name it, the thing disintegrates. It becomes one with everything. And your psyche is exactly the same. Your sense of self, your sense of egoic self, can only be in opposition to or in comparison with. And that brings enormous suffering, but that suffering has the payoff of at least knowing that you are. If you take that away, then you land in an existential morass, and for the thinking mind, that is untenable, because the thinking mind is a machine of creating questions and trying to answer questions. And the existential void, the being one with everything, is just one big open question. And therefore, it creates an enormous amount of anxiety. So we can do a lot of work to notice our attitudes, notice our beliefs, do a lot of psychosomatic work to erode trauma, get rid of beliefs that don't serve us, and all those kind of things. But at the very core, the very seed at the center of suffering that keeps generating duality, that keeps generating the sense of a separate me and therefore another, whether it is another person or the world at large, or even the future or the past. To eliminate that, we need to merge those two psychosomatically so that the distinction is essentially gone. And liberation can only take place when you are not there. So long as you feel like a separate me that wants to preserve itself, you can only do that in opposition to, and that will create suffering. And whether you acquire what you want or whether you keep chasing it and suffering because you don't have it, you will continue to preserve that suffering because it confirms an existence or a supposed real existence or being of the ego, which is not really there. And therefore it's a futile chase. It's something that will never deliver. So in summary, we have the idea that in order to feel that we truly are as a separate entity, our ego preserves suffering so that it has something to push against. It has friction and it has comparison. And it says, well, the fact that I'm suffering means that I am. And that much at least I can confirm. And therefore I won't let go of the suffering, because who would I be without it? Or even more deeply, would I be without my suffering? And that is a question that the ego is not willing to answer. And therefore we have, of course, other techniques and ways to circumvent that. Very curious to hear what you have to say about these ideas in the comment section. So yeah, feel free to comment. And also, if you think that these are topics from which other people would benefit, then remember that liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing with people you know is very motivating to me, and it also makes the content available to others who might benefit from it. And as usual, I'll be back with more pretty soon. And until then, thanks for listening. Bye-bye.